Welcome to Season 2 of Telling Tales. This season we meet up with some old friends and make some new ones. I'll take you on adventures through time, visit mysteries and answer questions such as where does Mustafa Khan go next? And what happened to John Paul Doherty? Welcome to Telling Tales Season 2, written and presented by me, Jeff Price. This story is called The Earworm. It was one of those all too familiar mornings, and Tony Corrigan was feeling a little hungover from the pub quiz. Drinking on a school night never seemed like a good idea, but he was trying to summon up the courage to chat up the new French teacher when it hadn't gone well. Emma Davis wasn't French, but lived in Paris for 4 years, adopting the effortless sophistication of a Parisian accent. There wasn't a single 14-year-old schoolboy in Heaton High who didn't have a crush on her. Even a few of the girls had teenage fantasies about her. To Tony, she was the embodiment of beauty. He was a hopeless romantic, and to him her hair was the colour of black garlic, her lips as enticing as a crisp Bordeaux wine, and a figure he would have climbed the Bastille walls to get to. Tony composed poems about her beauty and had long conversations with her about the poetry of Baudelaire and the music of Jacques Brel. Oh, he would have, but in reality he became tongue-tied every time she spoke to him, and he stuttered like a chicken. The alarm rang again, and Tony stumbled over to the window and opened the curtains. As the morning light rushed in, he slumped back down on the bed, and suddenly a tune began to play in his head. Bloody hell, where did that come from? It was a shock, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't remember where it had come from at all. He stumbled out of bed, switched on the radio. Zoe Ball's depressingly cheerful voice chirped, "And now to Tina Delary for the news." And he groaned. And he made his way into the kitchen and put the kettle on for his morning coffee. He washed down 2 paracetamol with a slug of sweet black coffee. In the shower, he stood soaking up the soothing waves of water, and once again the opening bars of a violin solo played out, swirling around his brain. On the radio, the pounding beats of the opening bars of Obvious Child by Paul Simon began. As Tony got out of the shower, he dried himself to the rhythm. "I'll get rid of that bloody earworm," he said. But no sooner had he thought of the words than the drums went silent, and once again the violin solo took over. He turned up the radio's volume so loud it was shaking the windows. The beat began again, and this time it wasn't Paul Simon, it was Mr. Moyer from the flat above, banging on the floor and shouting. He glanced at his phone for the time. "Shit! 7:45, I'm going to be late." Everybody at Heaton High loved Tony. His pupils loved him. His fellow teachers loved him. Even the dinner ladies loved him. But not Mr. Rutherford. The head was a man of numbers, reports, spreadsheets and neatness, all of which Tony was terrible at. He was good at turning an economics level syllabus into stories that made complex economic theories easy to understand and fun to learn. He was good at mentoring the new teachers and showing them the ropes, and good at covering for the older teachers. And he was very good at complimenting the dinner ladies on their less than exquisite food. He was also very bad at turning up on time, or anything that involved deadlines. 10 minutes until I leave, he thought. At that exact moment, he remembered that he had to give a talk on punctuality at the morning assembly, which Tony thought was the very definition of irony. He'd written nothing, had thought of nothing, hadn't even thought about it at all since he was volunteered by Mr. Rutherford at the staff meeting. He hadn't actually heard any of the discussion on punctuality, as he was busy daydreaming about Emma Davis and asking her out, and when he heard his name mentioned, he just said, "Yes," and went back to the imaginary romantic meal for two at a French brasserie. Tony grabbed his bike, swung his backpack over his shoulder, and headed down the corridor. As he left the building, Mr. Moyer was standing in the front of the mailboxes. Word, Tony." "Sorry, Chris, for the noise. I have to dash. Doing an assembly this morning. Sorry." Tony made a mental note to get him a bottle of wine. He didn't want another complaint going to the landlord of the block. Fortunately for Tony, the school was only a few minutes from his apartment, and he just managed to make it onto the stage in the main hall as the last of the 800 boys and girls settled down. Mr. Rutherford was reading out the notices about changes in timetables and warning the boys not to cause any trouble at Saturday's football match between Heaton High and the Catholic Grammar School of St. Cuthbert's, an annual event with a reputation for trouble that made the Battle of Agincourt look like a summer picnic. "Now, boys and girls," Mr. Rutherford continued, "Mr. Corrigan wants to say a few words about punctuality." And as he moved away from the microphone to make way for Tony, he looked him in the eye and whispered, "A thing he knows nothing about." Thank you, Headmaster. Punctuality is defined by the Oxford Concise Dictionary as the act of being on time. Tony had actually no idea what the Oxford Dictionary said, but he knew no one was checking, and in fact, very few people were actually listening. Tony continued in the knowledge that he only had to talk for a few minutes, and suddenly he remembered a quote. As the poet and playwright Oscar Wilde once said, "I'm always late on principle, my principle being that punctuality is the thief of time." There were some bemused faces amongst a few of the boys, but Mr. Rutherford scowled. On the front row, Emma chuckled. Tony flashed a smile at her and immediately was transported to a little cafe in Provence. He quickly wrapped up his talk and handed it over to the chaplain for morning prayers. And as he sat down, the chaplain, Mr. Benedict, was punting out a prayer with the enthusiasm of a man on his way to the scaffold. Tony searched his mind for the cafe, but now all that was there was the Earworm, which had become part of a larger cinematic production with fields of wild poppies and birds of all shapes and sizes swirling across the sky. The clink of wine glasses was replaced by clarinets and oboes, and the aroma of fresh croissants was lost in the sound of the violin. Bell for the end of assembly rang, and Tony was catapulted back from his fantasy. Picking up his backpack as he made his way to his form class for registration, Emma came over and lightly touched his arm and said, "That was funny. Well done." He could feel himself blush, and all he could summon up to say in reply was, "Ta," before she disappeared into a stream of pupils and teachers making their way back down the corridor. For the rest of the day, he couldn't concentrate on anything. That touch, the "well done," was all that filled his mind. He made his mind up to speak to her. But Emma wasn't in the staff room at the lunch break, and by the time he left school, he cycled home, a broken man. It was nearly 7 o'clock when he switched on the TV for the news. There was an advert extolling the virtues of switching a car insurance, just so you could get cheap cinema tickets, when an advert came on for a range of vegetarian sausages. It was a pastoral scene, a gentle hillside covered in vivid yellow sunflowers. Red squirrels leapt from branch to branch, and a young couple strolled hand in hand through a woodland glade as above them a lark hovered to the sound of a violin. "Bloody hell, that's it," Tony thought. "It's that lark thingy." And for a moment or two he struggled to remember the proper name, something to do with rising. "That's it," he thought, and he typed into Spotify, "The Lark Rising." There was a brief pause, then Spotify suggested "The Lark Ascending" by Vaughan Williams. Ah, that's it! As Tony listened, he was transported to a French country scene where him and Emma Davis skipped, holding hands through a field of ripening wheat. Above them, rising into the deep blue sky, a lark serenaded their love. They both paused and looked up, and Emma turned and kissed him, and as he drifted skyways, he followed the lark to paradise. In the distance, a microwave now pinged, and Tony was snapped back out of his dream and went to retrieve his Charlie Bingham beef bourguignon. Tomorrow, he thought, tomorrow I'm going to ask her out. If you enjoyed this episode, then please support my podcast by buying me a coffee. Click the heart logo in the top corner of the website page and donate. If you're on another podcast provider, then check out buymeacoffee.com and search for Jeff Price N3. Thank you. You can contact Telling Tales direct by emailing tellingtalesjeffprice@gmail.com. Until the next time, goodbye.